The green Chevy Malibu was cruising down Route 100, moving steadily through late afternoon traffic as the sun dipped low over Chester County. Inside, Bianca Roberson sat behind the wheel, focused but relaxed, her mind replaying the events of the day. She had just returned from a college prep session, one of the last steps before stepping fully into adulthood, a life she had worked tirelessly to prepare for. Up ahead, the highway narrowed. 2 lanes were about to merge into one, and the flow of cars began tightening like a funnel. Drivers edged forward, eager to claim their place in line. As Bianca approached the bottleneck, another vehicle pulled up beside her, fast, aggressive, and unwilling to slow down. What should have been a routine merge quickly turned into a silent contest of pride between 2 strangers who refused to yield. In the space of a heartbeat, everything unraveled. A flash of movement came from the driver's side of the other car, and a loud crack shattered the hum of engines. Bianca's car veered sharply off the road, clipped the shoulder, and slammed into the tree line with violent force. The impact crushed the front end of the vehicle and sent smoke rising into the air, signaling to no one in particular that something horrific had just occurred. Other drivers continued past without fully realizing what they had just witnessed. Some thought it was a fender bender, maybe a tire blowout. No one imagined that a young woman had just been shot in the head, killed instantly by a bullet from a stranger's gun, fired over something as meaningless as who should go first. In the hours that followed, Bianca's family would search for her in panic, law enforcement would comb through highway footage frame by frame, and the nation would soon find itself facing yet another haunting example of how quickly lives can be destroyed by unchecked anger behind the wheel. This story is not a cautionary tale told from a distance. It is an intimate journey into the life and death of a girl whose only mistake was trying to get home. Over the next few minutes, we will retrace every moment, from the final merge on Route 100 to the manhunt that stunned the country, and we will uncover the identity of the man who pulled the trigger, the motive that shocked investigators, and the heartbreaking aftermath that changed a family forever. Bianca Roberson never imagined that choosing a college could be the last decision she'd ever make. And neither will you. Before we dive deeper into this haunting case, if you're drawn to real-life mysteries, unsolved crimes, and the chilling truth behind headlines, you're in the right place. This is Crime Scene Chronicles, where we go beyond the surface and tell the stories that deserve to be remembered. If you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case that could change how you see the world. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the girl whose future was just starting. Some people carry a light so real, it's hard to imagine the world without it, until it's gone. Bianca Roberson was one of those people. She wasn't famous. She didn't have millions of followers. She wasn't chasing attention or building a brand. She was just building a life. A real one. Grounded, focused, and full of promise. She grew up in West Chester, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburb about 25 miles outside of Philadelphia. It wasn't flashy, but for the Roberson family it was home. A place of structure, love, and hard-won peace. Her mother, Michelle Roberson, was the heartbeat of that home. A woman with the kind of strength you only recognize in hindsight. Michelle raised Bianca and her older brother mostly on her own. She worked hard, really hard, to provide stability. She taught her children early on that respect wasn't optional, and that dreams were valid, but only if you were willing to work for them. And Bianca listened. She watched her mom hold everything together. She saw the sacrifices, the long hours, the tight budgets, the way Michelle never let struggle turn into bitterness. That example shaped her more than any class ever could. Bianca's father passed away when she was young. She didn't talk about it much, but it left a mark. The kind of mark that doesn't break you but instead makes you see things differently. While other kids her age worried about popularity, Bianca was thinking about purpose. She was thinking about how short life could be. Her older brother, Rodney, was her protector and her biggest rival, in the way only siblings can be. They had their own language, their own banter, their own way of loving each other that didn't need to be explained. And when Rodney left for college, Bianca saw it as her turn to step up, to make her own mark. At Bayard Rustin High School, Bianca wasn't the type to demand attention, but she earned it anyway. Teachers described her as bright, determined, and mature beyond her years. She didn't just want good grades, she wanted to understand the why behind everything. And when she said she wanted to study forensic science, nobody laughed. It made sense. Of course Bianca wanted to help solve mysteries. Of course she wanted to help victims speak, even after they were gone. She once said, "I don't want to guess, I want to know. I want the facts, even if they're hard." That was her. Never afraid of the truth. Never afraid of the work. She didn't need to be the center of attention. She just wanted to matter. And she did. Especially to her mom. Michelle Roberson would later describe Bianca as her best friend. They did everything together: errands, hair appointments, movie nights. They'd argue like sisters and laugh like old friends. Michelle said Bianca had an old soul, but also the kind of laugh that could snap you out of a bad mood in seconds. On June 28, 2017, Bianca left the house to attend a college prep session. It wasn't a big event, just a routine meeting to lock in class schedules and go over housing details for her upcoming freshman year at Jacksonville University. She was excited. She was ready. There was no sense of finality in the air that morning. No warning. No gut feeling. Just a regular day filled with the kind of optimism that makes the end feel so unthinkable in hindsight. She got in her car. She texted her mom. She told her she'd be home soon. And then she never made it. So before we talk about the highway, before we talk about the shot that ended everything, you need to know who she really was. Bianca Roberson was the kind of daughter every parent hopes for. The kind of student every teacher remembers. The kind of young woman the world needed more of, not less. And the tragedy of her story isn't just how she died, it's how much life she still had left to live. She had no idea the world was already moving without her. No sense that, by sunset, her name would be echoing through police radios and newsroom headlines. Bianca Roberson wasn't running from anything. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was simply driving home from a college prep session, head full of course plans, heart full of hope. In the timeline of her life, this was supposed to be a page you flip through, not the chapter you close. June 28, 2017 didn't start like a tragedy. It started like any other warm summer day in Westchester, Pennsylvania. The air was thick with sun, traffic moved like it always did, and for Bianca, the next stop was just one more errand on her way to adulthood. She had things to do. Life was happening. Her college acceptance into Jacksonville University was official, and every little task, every form signed, every trip out the door, was part of that larger dream she'd worked so hard to earn. She wasn't just excited, she was ready. Bianca left the house that day in her green Chevy Malibu. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers. That car represented movement, independence. A kind of freedom that every teenager looks forward to, but only few truly understand. Her mom, Michelle, expected her back that evening. Nothing special was planned, just dinner. A regular conversation around the table. Maybe a little teasing from her older brother, Rodney. The kind of night that ends in quiet laughter and a phone charging on the nightstand. But Route 100 had something else waiting. As Bianca drove along the stretch near West Goshen Township, the two lanes ahead began to narrow into one. A bottleneck. Everyone has been there, the moment when you either slow down, speed up, or trust the other driver to do the right thing. A red pickup appeared beside her. Eyewitnesses said it was moving fast, trying to merge ahead. What happened next wasn't road rage in the way movies portray it. There was no yelling, no horn blaring, no chase. Just two vehicles, side by side, for a moment too long. Then a single shot. Fired from the driver's side window of the truck, through Bianca's glass into her head. Her car didn't stop. It drifted, smooth, almost quiet, off the road, rolled down the embankment and slammed into a tree. Smoke lifted into the sky. Onlookers slowed, confused. It looked like a crash. But it wasn't. Paramedics found her still buckled in, head tilted, engine humming. There were no skid marks. No attempts to brake. Because she didn't even have time to react. Word reached her family before the news did. Michelle had been calling, texting, wondering why she was late. And when the police finally came to the door, her mother said she already knew something wasn't right. There is no way to prepare a parent to hear, "Your daughter has been shot." Bianca's day started with dreams and ended without warning. A future cut short by a stranger's impulse and a single second of cruelty. It was supposed to be a short drive. It became her last. And while she lay motionless at the base of a tree, the man who pulled the trigger was already gone, vanishing into traffic, leaving behind no name, no license plate, and no trace. The moment began like any other. Two cars approaching a merge, two drivers assessing the space ahead, both expecting the other to yield. It was the kind of situation that plays out on highways across the country every day, a silent standoff measured in speed, distance, and instinct. Panic moved through the scene slowly at first. Police began to secure the area. Paramedics confirmed there was nothing they could do. A young woman had been shot and killed behind the wheel of her own car during afternoon traffic, and the shooter had already vanished. There were no clues left behind, no fingerprints, no weapon, no license plate captured in time. What remained were the words of shaken witnesses and the haunting silence of a family who didn't yet know their world had been shattered. This was not a crash. This was not an accident. This was a choice made in seconds by a man who believed a lane on the road was worth more than a human life. Bianca Roberson had followed every rule. She had made no mistake. She was simply in the way of someone else's ego. And now she was gone. When Bianca didn't return home at the time her mother expected, there was no instant alarm, no rush to panic, and no immediate suspicion that something had gone wrong. Her mother, Michelle Roberson, simply assumed her daughter had stopped somewhere briefly, maybe to grab food or run an extra errand, and would be walking through the door any minute. The hours between late afternoon and early evening tend to move slowly for parents who are waiting, and during that time Michelle checked her phone periodically, expecting to see a message or missed call that would explain the delay. She sent a text first, thinking it would reach Bianca before a call would, but when no response came through she tried calling directly and was met with the sound of a voicemail greeting she had heard 100 times before. As the sun began to sink and the silence continued, Michelle's instincts began to shift from mild concern to something far more uncomfortable. An ache in the chest that only mothers truly understand, that quiet signal the body sends when something feels wrong, even if the mind hasn't caught up yet. She called again and again, hoping that each new ring would end with a familiar voice on the other end of the line, but each time the call dropped into voicemail, the weight in her stomach grew heavier. She began reaching out to friends and family, asking if anyone had seen Bianca, spoken to her, or received a message that might explain the delay. With each reply that said no, each unanswered call, each text that remained unread, the reality that something might truly be wrong crept closer to the front of her mind. Still, she held on to hope because hope is often the last thing a mother lets go of. When the knock finally came at the door, it wasn't loud or frantic, but it carried a gravity that reached Michelle before she even opened it. 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions serious but restrained, and in that single moment before any words were spoken, Michelle's world began to tremble beneath her. They didn't begin with the worst of it, they never do. The officers first asked her name and confirmed that she was Bianca's mother, and then they gently asked if they could come inside to speak with her. That small request was enough to confirm what her heart already knew but her mind refused to accept, that something irreversible had happened. They told her there had been a car crash involving Bianca's vehicle along Route 100, and while the words landed softly as if padded to protect her, Michelle could already feel the walls of her life collapsing inward. She asked if her daughter was okay, still desperate for a version of the story that would leave Bianca alive, even if injured, but then came the truth that no parent should ever have to hear. The officers explained that her daughter had been found inside the crashed vehicle with a fatal gunshot wound to the head, and that Bianca had died instantly before help could arrive. Those words didn't hit all at once. They came in waves, each one louder and more unbearable than the last, until the room around her felt like it was folding in on itself. Michelle didn't scream or shout or collapse to the ground the way movies often show. Instead, she went completely still, as though her entire nervous system had shut down to protect her from the impact of what she had just heard. She listened as they continued speaking, but none of it landed. Not the details, not the explanations, not the questions, because the only sentence that mattered had already been said. Rodney, Bianca's older brother, received the news shortly after, and his reaction was immediate and devastating. He dropped to the floor in disbelief, unable to form words, as though someone had reached inside him and stolen something that could never be replaced. For a long time he stayed there, numb and breathless, trying to process how the sister he had spoken to just hours earlier could now be gone without warning. News of the incident began to spread across the community, though at first the details were unclear. Some believed it had been a simple accident on the highway, while others speculated about road conditions or driver error. But as more information surfaced, the reality became clearer. This was not an accident, and Bianca Roberson had not died because of a mistake behind the wheel. The crash site had been discovered by a passing driver who noticed the green Chevy Malibu off the side of the road and contacted emergency services, believing the driver might be in need of assistance. When first responders arrived and looked into the car, they expected to find an injury caused by the impact, but what they saw instead was a single bullet wound, clear, unmistakable, and fatal. Everything changed in that moment. What had looked like a tragedy became a crime scene, and what had felt like a horrible accident revealed itself as something far more deliberate and terrifying. The person responsible had not simply caused harm through recklessness or poor judgment. They had aimed a gun, pulled the trigger, and ended a young life with no warning, no remorse, and no trace left behind. Michelle Roberson would later say that there are no words to describe the feeling of losing a child so suddenly and violently, That even breathing becomes a foreign task when your entire reason for existing has been taken from you without explanation. One morning she was discussing dorm checklists and travel dates, and by nightfall she was identifying her daughter's body in a sterile room, surrounded by strangers in uniform. It was not supposed to end this way. No future this bright should be reduced to an autopsy and a case number. No mother should be left holding the silence where a voice used to be. And yet, that was exactly what had happened. The pain had only just begun. Once the reality of Bianca's death had settled in, and the cause confirmed not as a crash, but a fatal gunshot, the investigation escalated immediately. Local authorities in West Goshen Township knew they were no longer responding to a highway accident. They were now dealing with a homicide in broad daylight, carried out on a busy Pennsylvania road, with no warning and no known suspect. Officers began their work with what little information they had. The wrecked green Malibu was towed for forensic examination, and every inch of it was photographed, logged, and studied for anything that might point to the shooter. The bullet hole on the driver's side window was clean and precise, giving investigators a clear trajectory. The shattered glass inside the vehicle suggested the shot had been fired from a very close range, close enough that the shooter must have been directly parallel to Bianca when he pulled the trigger. The red pickup truck, mentioned by early witnesses, became the immediate focus. Multiple drivers who had been on Route 100 that afternoon recalled seeing a red Chevrolet or GMC-style truck alongside Bianca's vehicle just before the crash. Some remembered its aggressive driving. Others remembered how quickly it had disappeared after the shot was fired. But none had gotten a license plate and no one had seen the driver's face. Law enforcement quickly issued a public appeal, asking for any dashcam footage, eyewitness accounts, or tips from people who had been on the road that day. Press conferences were held. Officers stood beside microphones and pleaded with the public for help, knowing that whoever had killed Bianca was still out there, armed, dangerous, and very possibly willing to do it again. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras was pulled and reviewed frame by frame. Investigators pored over hours of video, looking for any vehicle matching the red truck's description, and slowly began piecing together its movements before and after the shooting. A few blurry images captured a vehicle that might have been the one involved, but nothing was clear enough to confirm an identity or even a license plate. With the case gaining attention and the suspect still unknown, the FBI joined the investigation. Their presence brought more resources, broader jurisdiction, and a sense of national urgency. The agency's behavioral analysts and ballistics experts reviewed the evidence collected so far, while digital teams attempted to track any social media activity or phone pings that might suggest involvement or provide leads. As days passed, the story spread across Pennsylvania and quickly reached national headlines. The words "road rage" began appearing in bold across news sites, television screens, and front pages. But for many people, especially in black communities, those two words felt far too convenient and far too empty. A young black woman had been killed by a white man in a red truck for no visible reason, and the conversation quickly turned to something deeper than just traffic violence. People began to ask whether this was truly just a moment of impulsive anger or if it was something more chilling. Was it hate? Was it a racially charged decision masked as road rage? Would the investigation be different if the victim were white, or if the suspect were black? These questions fueled town hall meetings, social media threads, and televised debates, and they brought more eyes to the case, even as the authorities were still struggling to find the man responsible. Michelle Roberson stood before cameras just days after burying her daughter. Her voice was steady, but her grief sat just beneath the surface as she asked the public for help. She spoke of Bianca's dreams, her discipline, her goodness, and she begged anyone who knew anything at all, to come forward. The pain in her voice couldn't be rehearsed, and the country listened. They didn't just hear a mother's heartbreak, they heard the sound of a life interrupted, and a justice system that had not yet caught up. Billboards began going up across Pennsylvania and beyond, each one showing Bianca's photo beside a sketch of the suspect's vehicle. The words "road rage murder" sat in bold at the top, urging drivers to pay attention, to remember what they saw, and to report what they knew. A reward was offered for any information that could lead to an arrest, and tips began trickling in from people who thought they had seen the truck, or someone who might be connected to it. But the manhunt was slow and the trail felt cold. Days turned into a week, then two. And for Bianca's family, the silence that followed her funeral was louder than anything they had ever heard. The pain had not faded. The outrage had not calmed. The questions had not been answered. Somewhere out there, the man who had stolen her future was still free. For over a week, investigators worked in overlapping shifts, following a growing trail of fragments, witness reports, camera footage and vehicle descriptions, hoping that somewhere in the chaos, a name would emerge. Behind closed doors, the case was becoming more urgent by the hour. The public was watching, Bianca's family was grieving, and the man who had fired a single bullet into her car remained invisible. On July 2nd, nearly 4 days after the shooting, a major break surfaced. A tip led investigators to a red Chevrolet pickup truck matching the description provided by multiple witnesses. The vehicle had been hidden behind a barn in Chester County. It was dusty, abandoned, and partially concealed, almost as if someone had deliberately tried to erase it from sight. Once authorities arrived, they quickly confirmed that the truck was registered to a man named Eric Descarlo Hodgson. With that discovery, the case shifted instantly from searching for a phantom to chasing a man with a name, a face, and a past. Eric Hodgson was a 28-year-old white male who had previously served in the military, a detail that raised immediate concerns within the investigative team. His military background suggested he was trained, disciplined, and possibly capable of navigating difficult terrain while avoiding detection. But there was more. His record hinted at instability, disciplinary actions, episodes of aggression, and behavioral red flags that had left those around him uneasy long before Bianca ever entered his path. Neighbors described him as reclusive and erratic. Some said he kept to himself. Others whispered about sudden outbursts, a short temper, and a growing paranoia that seemed to deepen over time. There were rumors that he had mental health struggles, but nothing confirmed. What became clear, however, was that Hodgson wasn't just a man with a temper. He was someone who could snap without warning, and who had already done so with deadly consequences. As law enforcement expanded the manhunt, they released his name and photo to the public, alerting nearby states and urging anyone with knowledge of his whereabouts to come forward. Media outlets picked up the story immediately, and Hodgson's face began to appear across televisions, smartphones, and newspapers. The words armed, dangerous, and unpredictable were repeated by every anchor, every headline, and every press release, because that was exactly what he had become. Authorities tracked his last known locations and began piecing together a digital footprint from cell towers, gas station cameras, and bank transactions. Every piece of data was studied: credit card use, toll passes, security camera timestamps. Each breadcrumb brought them closer, but the fear was growing. If Hodgson had already pulled the trigger once over something as petty as a traffic merge, there was no telling what he might do next. The FBI increased its involvement, bringing in specialists trained in fugitive behavior and high-risk apprehension. Tactically, the operation was becoming more aggressive. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It had become a pursuit of a volatile man who was actively evading capture, and who could harm others if not stopped soon. The Roberson family waded through the chaos, watching the news like everyone else, each update bringing a mix of dread and hope. They wanted answers, but more than anything they needed closure. Every hour that passed without an arrest felt like another blow to a wound that had barely begun to scar. Hodgson remained on the run for several days. Authorities believed he might have been heading toward Delaware or possibly moving south to avoid detection. He left behind very little, but he was still a man who needed fuel, food, and sleep, and eventually all fugitives make a mistake. When they finally located him, he was found hiding in the attic of a relative's home, curled into the dark crawlspace beneath the beams, armed and exhausted. The arrest was swift, quiet, and carefully executed to avoid triggering a violent response. After almost a week of evading justice, Eric Hodgson was finally in custody. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He didn't offer any explanation. The man who had taken Bianca Roberson's life said nothing. The silence, once again, was louder than anything else. After days of tracking movements and compiling leads, the pattern finally revealed itself. The red pickup had been the thread that held the investigation together, and once it was recovered from a remote location, investigators had their first solid lead. What followed was a delicate puzzle: pieces of surveillance footage, eyewitness statements, and digital traces that slowly began to form the outline of a man trying desperately to disappear. Hodgson hadn't gone far. He had crossed into neighboring areas and switched between temporary hideouts, using his familiarity with local backroads and his ability to lie low in places that wouldn't raise suspicion. He had avoided using his own name for purchases. He had turned off his phone. But his efforts weren't flawless. Surveillance cameras near gas stations and convenience stores captured blurred figures that matched his description. Timestamps revealed a pattern: early morning movements, brief stops, deliberate silence. He wasn't living on the run in the wild. He was hiding in the shadows of normal neighborhoods, trusting that his face wouldn't be recognized by the average person pumping gas beside him. The real breakthrough came from a tip. A family member had grown uneasy, suspicious that Hodgson might be nearby. Whether it was guilt, fear, or concern for safety, someone spoke up. Authorities acted quickly. The address was placed under quiet surveillance. Patterns of movement around the house confirmed what the caller feared. Eric DeScarlo Hodgson was hiding inside. Law enforcement didn't rush in immediately. They waited, watched, and planned. The house was located in Westtown Township. It was quiet, surrounded by trees, and gave the illusion of safety, until tactical units moved in just after nightfall, their approach silent and calculated. Officers entered the home with caution, scanning each room slowly, their commands clear and forceful. They found Hodgson not in a bedroom or basement, but tucked into the crawlspace of the attic, curled up, filthy, and motionless. His weapon was nearby but not in his hand. He offered no resistance. He made no statement. He was pulled from the shadows without struggle, his eyes empty and his expression unreadable. The arrest was immediate, and within minutes the news had reached Bianca's family. Michelle Roberson, standing in the very house where she had once helped her daughter pack for college, received the call that the man who had killed Bianca was finally in custody. The weight of those words settled differently than she had expected. There was no joy, no triumph, only a deep, crushing relief tangled with fresh grief. She had prayed for this moment. She had waited through days that stretched endlessly and nights that never gave her rest. She had stood in front of cameras, begged for leads, and stared at empty chairs where her daughter should have been. Now the man who had changed everything was behind bars, but her child was still gone. Rodney, Bianca's brother, didn't celebrate either. He simply sat in silence after hearing the news. Knowing that someone had been caught didn't bring his sister back. It didn't fill the space her voice once occupied. It didn't erase the image of the funeral. What it did bring was something quieter, an end to uncertainty, a name to point to, a direction for justice to begin. The community responded with a wave of cautious relief. Many had feared that the case would go unsolved, that the man responsible would simply vanish and become another ghost of the justice system. The arrest brought a measure of accountability, a small sign that someone would answer for what had been done. But even as Hodgson was led into custody and the story flooded local headlines once more, there was no sense of resolution. The damage had already been done. A life had been taken in a moment of arrogance and rage, and no court proceeding could restore what had been lost on that stretch of highway. Still, for the first time since Bianca's murder, the balance had begun to shift. The suspect had a name. He had been found. He would face the system. And the story, finally, would move forward. The courtroom was not built to hold this kind of grief, but it tried. On the day the trial began, every seat was filled. Friends, family members, reporters, law students, and complete strangers came not just to witness a legal proceeding, but to look directly at the man who had turned an ordinary moment into a lifetime of pain. Some had come for justice. Some had come for answers. But no one was prepared for the silence that swallowed the room the moment the defendant entered. Eric DeScarlo Hodgson walked in with the same blank expression he had worn the day he was arrested. His eyes drifted, never settling. His posture was slouched, but his hands were steady. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch when Bianca's name was mentioned. If he felt remorse, it never showed. The prosecution opened with a statement that needed no dramatics. They laid out the facts slowly, placing every detail on the table with surgical precision. They explained the location of the bullet wound, the angle from which it had been fired, and the specific make and model of the red pickup truck that had been found hidden behind a barn days after the shooting. They introduced witness statements from drivers on Route 100 who had seen Hodgson's truck aggressively attempting to merge, and they showed surveillance footage of his movements before and after the murder. But it was not the facts that broke the room, it was the voices. When Michelle Roberson took the stand, her strength carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Her voice never cracked at first. She spoke clearly, recounting the final morning she saw her daughter alive, the text messages that were never answered, and the moment officers stood in her doorway and spoke the words she would never forget. But as she tried to describe the silence that followed, the quiet inside the house that once echoed with Bianca's laughter, her voice trembled. And then it broke. She paused, wiped her eyes, and looked across the room toward the man who had taken her child. There was no hatred in her face. There was only devastation wrapped tightly around a question that no one could answer. Why? Rodney followed his mother to the witness stand. He didn't speak with the same calm. His pain arrived raw, unfiltered, heavy with rage that had nowhere to go. He described the funeral, the sleepless nights, the way he sometimes forgot and still expected Bianca to walk through the door, phone in hand, already laughing about something. He told the courtroom that losing his sister felt like losing his own reflection, and he ended his testimony by asking whether Hodgson had even looked in the mirror since pulling the trigger. The defense argued that the shooting was impulsive and that Hodgson had acted in a moment of psychological collapse. They referenced his military history, hinted at untreated trauma, and tried to draw sympathy from a life that had clearly spiraled into darkness long before the incident on Route 100. They acknowledged his guilt but asked the court to consider mercy, to weigh his intent against his mental state. But the prosecution never let the room forget that intent does not erase impact. One bullet had ended a life. One choice had shattered a family. And regardless of whether Hodgson regretted it or not, Bianca Roberson was still gone. As testimony continued over several days, the atmosphere inside the courtroom remained dense with emotion. Jurors sat stiff in their chairs, some with their hands tightly clasped, others occasionally wiping tears they hoped no one would see. Reporters stopped scribbling when the family spoke. Spectators lowered their heads, unable to watch as Michelle described having to identify her daughter's body beneath a sterile white sheet. Then came the moment that would be remembered even after the verdict was read. As Michelle Roberson finished her final statement, she spoke directly to the judge. She said she wasn't asking for vengeance. She didn't need Hodgson to suffer. She only wanted him to understand what he had stolen, not just from her but from the world. She painted a picture of who Bianca was becoming, what she wanted to do, and how her daughter would have made the world better had she been given the chance. The judge sat still, listening intently. His face remained composed for most of the testimony. But as Michelle described holding Bianca's graduation photo in her lap on the night she was supposed to be moving into her dorm room, his expression changed. His eyes reddened. His jaw tightened. And as she finished her final words, he lowered his head and wiped a single tear from the corner of his eye. No gavel struck. No words interrupted. The entire room held its breath. The silence was not procedural, it was sacred. In that moment, justice did not feel like a legal outcome. It felt like shared grief. The trial ended with Hodgson pleading guilty to third-degree murder. There was no jury deliberation. No dramatic outbursts. Just a final statement from the bench, acknowledging that while the court could deliver a sentence, it could never restore what had been taken. The judge called Bianca's death a senseless tragedy, the kind that should never have happened, and said her name aloud one final time before concluding the trial. When the gavel finally came down, it sounded more like a farewell than a conclusion. Bianca Roberson had been heard. But justice, even when served, could not bring her back. The moment everyone had waited for arrived not with outrage or protest, but with a simple, formal declaration inside a courtroom that had already seen more grief than it was built to hold. Eric Descarlo Hodgson stood before the judge and entered a plea of guilty to third-degree murder, an acknowledgement of guilt, but not an admission of intent to kill. The plea meant there would be no lengthy trial. No dramatic back and forth between attorneys. No verdict to be read by a jury. Just paperwork, a judge's final words, and a sentence delivered with legal precision. Hodgson was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. A span of time that felt significant on paper but felt hollow to many of the people whose lives had been shattered by his actions. Inside the courtroom there were no outbursts. No shouts for more time. No visible signs of rage from Bianca's family. Only the steady ache of loss and the quiet, unresolved question that lingered in every heart. Was this truly enough? 20 years in prison for the life of a daughter who would never walk through the front door again. A sentence that might one day end with the same man walking free, while Michelle Roberson would continue waking up every day to a house missing its laughter, its rhythm, and its future. The prosecution had made their case. The evidence was irrefutable. The plea agreement was strategic, ensuring a conviction, avoiding the risk of a lighter sentence through trial complications, and sparing the family from reliving every painful detail in a drawn-out proceeding. Legally, it was considered a victory. But emotionally, it left something raw behind. Across the country, the news of the plea and sentencing stirred mixed reactions. Some applauded the decision, grateful that Hodgson would serve real time, and relieved that justice in its most basic form had not been denied. Others, especially within Bianca's community, questioned why the charge had been lowered from first-degree murder. They asked whether the system had once again devalued a black girl's life, whether the word rage had been used to excuse the unthinkable, and whether a different victim might have prompted a harsher charge. On talk shows, in Facebook comment sections, in community centers and church halls, people asked why a man who fired a gun into a moving car with no justification could be found guilty of something less than intentional murder. The legal answer was clear. The moral answer was not. Michelle Roberson did not speak publicly about the sentence immediately after it was handed down. She had said what she needed to say during the trial. She had stared directly at the man who had taken her child, and she had done it with grace, dignity, and an honesty that had shaken even the judge. What more could be said? Justice had arrived, but so had the limits of its reach. No court ruling could rewind the moment on Route 100. No prison cell could restore the light that had gone out in Michelle's home. No sentence, no matter how lengthy, could bring back the sound of Bianca's voice or the sight of her seat at the dinner table. The legal system had done its job. But for the people who loved Bianca, justice was not a destination. It was something more elusive, something still out of reach. And for many watching from the outside, the question remained suspended in the air, unanswered and heavy. Was it ever really enough? After the trial ended and the headlines began to fade, the world expected the Roberson family to quietly return to a life they no longer recognized. But Michelle Roberson had no intention of letting her daughter's story end in a courtroom transcript or a news archive. She refused to let Bianca's name be buried beneath a tragic headline or reduced to another statistic in America's endless cycle of gun violence. In the months that followed the sentencing, Michelle found herself standing in spaces she never thought she would enter: press conferences, panel discussions, vigils, schools and city halls, speaking the same name over and over again, determined that people would not forget the girl who was taken or the reason it happened. With quiet resolve and unimaginable strength, she established the Bianca Roberson Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on gun violence prevention, youth education, and community healing. What began as a way to cope with unbearable grief became a platform for change, a force that reached beyond Westchester, beyond Pennsylvania, and into the hearts of families who had experienced the same kind of loss. The foundation did more than raise awareness. It created scholarships for students who carried the same spirit Bianca had: driven, compassionate, grounded, and unafraid to dream beyond their zip code. It organized outreach programs in schools, encouraging young people to speak up about violence, to look out for each other, and to recognize that every decision, every moment of anger, every weapon within reach, carries consequences that ripple further than most people ever realize. Michelle became a voice in the anti-gun violence movement not because she sought the spotlight, but because her silence would have meant accepting a world where her daughter's death carried no purpose beyond pain. She stood on stages with survivors, with activists, with lawmakers, and she told her story again and again, not to relive the trauma, but to prevent another mother from standing in her place. Her message was never wrapped in anger or politics. It was always grounded in the truth of her experience. A mother who had done everything right, raised her child with love and discipline, sent her off to college with hope, and still lost her to a senseless act of cruelty on an ordinary highway. And through it all, Bianca's memory remained the foundation's guiding light. Every scholarship awarded, every event held, every young life touched by the foundation's work carried her name forward. Her photo remained on the banner. Her story was retold with dignity. Her laughter, her goals, her handwriting in the margins of notebooks, all of it lived on through the work her family refused to let die. In a world that often forgets the names of victims after the headlines move on, the Roberson family chose to keep Bianca's story alive by building something that would outlast their grief. They could have closed the door. They could have disappeared into the quiet. But they didn't. In the face of loss, they chose to build a legacy. And through that legacy, Bianca still speaks. As the credits of this story begin to roll in our minds, one truth refuses to let go: Bianca Roberson never made it to her college dorm. She never got the chance to unpack her bags, decorate her walls, or sit in her first lecture hall with wide eyes and bigger dreams. She never walked across a college campus wearing her university sweatshirt, or texted home about her first exam, or called her mother just to say she was homesick. And yet, in a way that defies explanation and bends the idea of legacy, she still managed to change the course of lives. Bianca's story was not supposed to end on Route 100. But because of what happened there, conversations were forced to happen. Laws were revisited. Voices were raised. Parents began talking to their children differently. Communities began asking harder questions about anger, about violence, about why we let everyday moments spiral into tragedy before anyone decides to slow down. Her name became more than just a reminder of loss. It became a call to reflect on the small moments we take for granted. The drive home, the shared dinner, the missed call, the decision to be kind instead of cruel when no one's watching. Bianca's absence became the reason others began to show up differently, live more attentively, and speak more boldly about what matters. If you've made it this far, you felt it too. This story wasn't just a report or a timeline. It was a life, full, vibrant, unfinished, and now it belongs to all of us. So wherever you are, pause for a moment. Think about someone you love. Think about how quickly time moves. Think about how easily silence can follow a name that once filled a room. And then do something, anything, to keep that name alive. Bianca's family chose advocacy. They chose courage. They chose to tell her story not with bitterness, but with hope that no one else would have to stand in the same place they did. You can help carry that hope forward. Share this story. Speak her name. Remember her face, not because of how her life ended, but because of everything it was meant to become. She didn't make it to college, but she changed the course of lives. And long after the trial closed, long after the camera stopped rolling, Bianca Roberson is still making people think, still moving people to act, and still showing us the power of choosing empathy over ego in the moments that matter most. If Bianca's story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something you can't quite shake, then you already understand why we tell these stories. At Crime Scene Chronicles, we don't just share cases. We preserve legacies, ask hard questions, and give voice to those who can't speak for themselves anymore. So if you're someone who believes in truth, in justice, and in stories that deserve to be remembered, I invite you to subscribe. Join this growing community of listeners who choose empathy over noise, and who understand that behind every headline, there is a human life. Tap the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because the next story might change the way you see the world too.